what the origin stories of Black workers and labor, and specifically Black women, tells us about exclusion, root causes, and what can we vision for involving our work in the labor movement. So I'd love for you to talk more about that.
Thank you, Kemi. So Kemi and I talk about this all the time. So there is often when we hear and see things an absence of grounding it in history. And so as one of the folks in one of the sessions I went to yesterday, the one that was on lobbying with racial justice, they talked about if we just say there's a disparity, there's a gap, we're just leaving people to fill in why that is. And we have to, as the people who are telling the story, who are setting the stage, we have to know what that history is. We have to be able to ground folks in it. And there's a way in which Black women in particular get erased. So in the same way that 90% of them were left out of the New Deal, they are continuously erased. And so at NELP, we have been working to center workers of color in the work we do, so that we know that we want to help all workers, but we also know that if we do something by default, it's going to pull in white male workers, right? And so we center Black workers in the center, and it's a concentric circle, and it gets larger and larger, and everyone is included. But we do it in a way to be intentional, to make sure that they are not left out.
And there's something about centering Black workers that responds to the specific context of the US and US imperialism and how the US was built. And this is especially true around the context of the South. And so I would love for you to talk about how that also informed your visioning and founding of the Breaking Barriers program at NELP, which was a very new direction for the organization, which specifically centers Black workers in the geographic South.
Sure. So I think lots of you know that one of NELP's core priorities is dismantling structural racism. And when we first landed on that priority about 3 years ago, we had to figure out, well, what does that look like for NELP? And how do we enter that space in a way that's authentic and that is not sort of elbowing the folks who have been doing that work for 25 years, like Ms. Hill. And one of the ways to do that is to take all of the wonderful talents and skills that NELP has and expertise and offer that and use that to amplify the work that people of color-led organizations are doing. And so pulling it in from this sort of broader context of looking at the research of Raj Chetty, where he showed that children have very low chances of economic mobility in the US. And there's a map that he uses or shows that's very color-coded and it's very dark in the South. And if you take that map and you overlay it to the states where there were slaves in 1865, it's almost an exact match. And so we see that history comes through whether we acknowledge it or not. And so in the Breaking Barriers project, we wanted to do some work that would help children by helping their parents. And so that work was grounded in supporting and amplifying the campaign that Ms. Hill has been working on for many years around injured workers, and for the New Orleans Worker Center for Racial Justice and the work that they're doing around fines and fees.
The other question I want to ask you specifically around Breaking Barriers, and I love how you said history comes through whether we acknowledge it or not, is the ways in which you live and embody that value within the structure. And a personal reflection is I have this very clear memory when I first started of us going to visit Jaribu for the first time in Mississippi and being in conversation, and I was very much in this place of like, okay, so how and what and this, and there was just this way in which you grounded the visit in it's just about being together and building relationship, and the room that creates, the possibility that creates is incredible. And so I'd love for you to just share a little bit more about why you see that being so critical to the how we do this work and how we actually embed it into the structures of our organization.
I do. There's a way in which some national organizations tend to approach working with local groups as kind of riding in on a white horse with a little bit of sub-grant and saying, we know what you should do, we got this money and we need you to do this, this, and this, are you interested? And that is not how Jaribu and I roll at all. And folks that know her know that definitely would not be the way. So, I don't think Jaribu will mind me telling this. So, I didn't know her at the beginning of this project. I had grown up in Mississippi, I had gone away to law school, I had come back and worked in Mississippi for about 3 years post-law school on some Katrina recovery and other economic justice issues in Mississippi, but our paths didn't really cross. And so when I signed on to do this project, I was like, I will make a relationship, don't you worry. And so I go to Schrock. Well, first some NELPers introduced me to Jaribu. I go to Schrock, and I'm following her around, trying to talk to her, and she's like, I'm busy, I gotta do this. And she's answering my questions and following her around. And so at the end of that, I was like, man, it's gonna be harder than I thought. So then I called one of my colleagues that I knew in Mississippi that knew her, and I said, can you call her and tell her I'm good people? And he was like, of course I can. And so he called, we were on a 3-way call. So she answered the phone. She answered the phone because it was him. And he said, just hold on, before you say anything, Rebecca's good people. Just listen to her, hear her out. And then he said, and I'm getting on the phone now. And that was the beginning of a really wonderful relationship. And so the time I spend with Jaribu is not about my knowledge and my wisdom. It's about hers. It's about what she feels like is the best thing for the workers that she represents, because she has the connection to them. So it's being able to be directed by the person who is closest and directly impacted, rather than coming in and saying, I know what's best. And so that's meant that we actually did create the space to just get to know each other, to just learn about what's important to her, what are some potential things we could work together on, because there's a lot of workers' rights issues in Mississippi, and there was a lot of resources that NELP wanted to offer towards that. But where we really ended up is where we started, which was around the Injured Workers Project, which is near and dear to her heart. And we actually had expertise on staff, Debbie Berkowitz, shout out, to help us craft a report that centered Black women catfish workers, and talked about the impact of injury and death from workplace injuries. And we're able to do that in a way that honored what Ms. Hill wanted to focus on, and that where we were definitely trying to make sure we were not exploiting the workers' stories, and that they were honored in what we were doing. And it was a fantastic report. It was able to generate coverage for the Workers Center, and it was covered as a front page story above the fold in the Clarion Ledger, which is the biggest paper in Jackson, Mississippi. So it's a way of following her lead rather than coming in and trying to tell her what she needs.
And putting the centering Blackness into practice within this region, and how powerful that is, and what that was modeled around what is possible, and how that shows up in the organization has also been really powerful. So I'm so grateful to your leadership. And Jaribu, I'm so grateful for your trust too. I didn't know it was a three-way call.
Yeah, it was an ambush. But a good one.
And in our conversation, one of the things that really sits with me is I was asking you how you have put into practice Black feminist praxis and centering Blackness into your work, is you talked about knowing. You talked about the embodying of knowing and how the work of Black feminists made that more possible in our movements. There's a quote by Octavia Butler that has really sat with me. I have the kind of imagination that hears. And we also talked about, with the knowing, with the imagination, there's so much of what is possible that's vision outside of a structure or a rubric. And so I would love for you to talk about this Black radical knowing, centering Blackness, and what does this make possible in how we vision and how we imagine and also how we design.
Wow. You know, I have really been reflecting on my work in this space for the last couple of years since I became president of Insight Center and have been in a leadership position, and really drawing on so many Black women before me, and knowing that what they were really saying, I'm going to point particularly to those women in the National Welfare Rights Organization, those women who, in my mind, set a course for understanding how our economy should work, who came out of sharecropping, who came off of reservations, and really spoke to and understood the future of our economy, understood that caretaking was going to be so critical to families, understood that wages were inadequate, understood that we needed a new economic structure. These are folks who, some with very low levels of education, formal education, but had a deep knowing. And I think that Black women, their lived experience, the way that they experience multiple forms of oppression and indignities, and how they move in the economy, have a deep knowing of what's wrong with the structures, with really understanding how it impacts people's lived experience beyond their own. And I really want to just tap into that knowing. Because a lot of times in this work, and I think particularly as Black women, we're really made to think that we're crazy. We're really made to think that our ideas are not good enough, and that they don't reflect a profound and deep understanding of not just our lives, but the lives of others. And so to be able to kind of ride on that sense of self and that deep sense of knowing is something that I'm just beginning to tap into myself. I often think, you know, to be in the nonprofit industrial complex is a real challenge because we're trying to talk about liberating others in a structure in of itself that's oppressive. And you know, oftentimes when I've really thought about what I think could take our work further, I've been constantly told no, not now. That's a good idea. Come back later. What evidence do you have? Is this a proven practice? I haven't seen it done before. What other groups are doing this? Have you talked to some of the national organizations? And there's not, when we talk about innovation, when we talk about who's actually moving us forward, and who get to be innovators, who has the freedom to innovate, to experiment, rarely is it a Black woman. Rarely are our lives lifted up in a way that could, I think, really take this nation forward. I think this nation could be taken forward with the ideas and the actions and the power building that Black women are doing, period. Period.
Yes, indeed. Yes,
So, you know, we've been doing some work at the Insight Center for a number of years. My work is on racial wealth inequities, and within that, you know, are so many things. Also, when you think about what wealth bestows is dignity. It bestows having some control and power over your life and agency, you know, and this idea of liberation. You know, what does that really mean for whom? Who gets to be free, right? And so, with this narrative work, it's something I've been studying for a long time with the racial wealth gap work, is really the fact that anti-Blackness is foundational to every economic policy we're living under, right? I mean, you mentioned a number of them, Rebecca. But in our work, when we really started to lay out a number of economic policies and test these cognitively with Americans, there's not one that is not, that where anti-Blackness does not undergird those policies. So in order for us to actually make progress in this country, we have to come to recognize that anti-Blackness is foundational. It's foundational, it's at the foundation of our economic policies. But that's a very, very difficult concept and idea for people to grasp, perhaps. I think it's something that's threatening. It's something even saying the word Blackness is threatening.
yes.
Saying Black people is threatening. And so the first time that we started to kind of pull this together, and Kemi has been involved in that work, we started to come up with this idea of like, how can we start to really think through a centering Blackness framework? And the first question, whenever I speak about this, is what about other people? Who else are you thinking about? I can never even get past the first sentence of centering Blackness without that question being posed. And we have to start asking ourselves, why is it so difficult for us to imagine centering Blackness? Because centering Blackness is a radical act. Centering Blackness will take our mindsets to a place where it's never been taken before, and to imagine a society that doesn't yet exist. And so this idea of knowing, in the face of this work that is completely unfunded, where, you know, I can't even get through the front door, the first conversation around it. And I've come to realize that for us to do this real work, it's gonna have to be done in the in-between places. It's gonna have to be done outside of someone asking me, what's your outcome?
That's right, that's right, that's right, that's right.
How will you know what's your proof and evidence that Blackness is relevant to our economy? And I'll tell you something about it. Even though, you know, when you lead an organization, it's frightening. You know, I need money, of course. But it's so freeing. It's freeing because someone is not dictating to me right now what this can actually be, and it's giving me room to innovate in the in-between places between all the other work that's happening. But I see it as so foundational. I see it as our next wave. You know, while we're now talking about racial equity, and we don't even really understand all of what that means. Racial equity has become diminished in so many ways. So many ways to the point where I think it will become the next diversity. We're going to have to challenge ourselves. To me, this is about getting to root causes. This is about digging at the root of why we're living in the conditions that we're in. And if we cannot get to the root causes, we cannot change the conditions in which people live, period. So, one of the things that I think is part of this work, and I'll stop after this one last point, is from this idea, this narrative work that we started, it became clear to people, we asked the question around, and one of the narratives is really around personal responsibility. and how damaging that narrative is. And we said, what if we, as we're grappling with this, what if we centered Blackness? And it changed everyone's direction. It changed the way they thought about the word, that narrative. It really changed the mindset. And so out of that work, we are launching a project that's called the Black Thought Project. And it is an idea to think about how we can create our own narratives. Our narratives that challenge anti-Blackness, that we can build ourselves, to create safe spaces for Black folks to be able to express themselves, and really begin for us to take a look at what kind of narratives can be, what is possible. And I'm really excited about this work. It's extremely emergent. But one of the things when we get together to work on it is it brings us so much joy. And to be able to have joy in this work, and that joy be centered around Blackness, to me is pretty much a radical act. So I am embracing my knowing in all its manifestations, because I think it's going to take the work so much further. Thank you.